Yo, what it is, YouTube? It's your boy Nitsa coming back with another bullseye of a video here today on the channel. I wanted to talk about Michael Jackson's whopping $40,000 signal flow, his vocal chain, his hardware chain. And let's talk about the brief history and everything like that today, right? He had like a couple of different microphones that he used, but one I see that he commonly used on a lot of songs that I like was the original AKG C12. So let's understand that this is also a tube microphone, right? So you're starting to see a pattern, right, with these signal chains, right? They're usually using tube microphones just because the actual topology, which I always try to get you guys to pay attention to, right? So the C12 is also a very special microphone in my humblest opinion because it has a very mid-forward way, you know, the way the tube is handling it, right? I don't know if it's 8 or 9 Polaroid patterns, so that made it a very versatile microphone. Let's also think about Bruce Swedien, who was Michael Jackson's engineer. He's like one of the first people who was doing educational things, right? Which is so amazing. That's a part of like engineering, right? Is showing love and giving information to people, right? So he used to record choirs and all that stuff. And one of those microphones he used was the C12 because it was very rich. It was very, you know, mid-forward. It helped add a lot of presence to the vocal by adding some of that, you know, harmonic content in the low mids. It looks like the rest of it is very flat relatively. And that's very interesting, you know, like contrasting that from like a C800 or a Telefunken 251, you know. So you guys have to always understand, you know, maybe sometimes you can get a mic that has like that same topology that will get you in the ballpark, but that will be unique to you, you know, because maybe it has a different frequency response. And, you know, pay attention to how it has that little boost at 10K hertz. You know, Michael Jackson, he had like a very high voice, or when he was getting to his high notes were, so you got to use equipment that is going to play into your strengths. You don't necessarily have to use, you know, a microphone that costs all this money is what I'm just saying. My main idea is that, you know, you got to find equipment that's playing to your strengths, that's helping. We also have the ability to use that, right, on the, you know, UAD console, right? That's what makes this such an amazing tool, this interface, right? You can do so many things, right? And we see that we have many Polaroid patterns. Now, for this, you know, in this modern time, that's nothing too crazy, right? But back in the day, you know, a microphone that had all of those patterns was very useful because some of them only had 2, which is like, you know, regular cardioid and maybe omnidirectional, like using it in a room mic fashion, right? And then the next thing Michael Jackson also had for his preamp is he had like a Neve 1084. I'm not gonna go over, you know, the Neve specifically that he had because I wasn't able to find it, you know. But one thing for sure I know is that the difference between the 1084 and the 1073 is that they actually have the same, you know, preamplification circuit, you know, so all of that, you know, transformer, transistor, you know, juiciness and creaminess, you know, that color, we still have that here. And I feel like that is actually very important to enhance Michael Jackson's nuances. Like he was the king of those nuances, right? And his engineer, Bruce Swedien, you know, this is what every engineer has to do. They have to see, how can I like get the most out of this artist? You know, like their vocal is like orange. So how can I squeeze the most sweetness out of it, right? And, you know, that goes into the equipment that they're picking, right? So I believe just the way, you know, those transistors are working on the high end, you know, when Michael Jackson used to be like all those little breathing and all those little hushes and pushes that he used to do, I feel like just the Neve was perfect because it kind of like does a little spikiness to it. So it gives a little bit more impact, you know, it helps capture that moment. That's what being an engineer is about. But the difference between the 84 and the 73, let me keep going into it, is the actual EQ circuit, right? So with the 1073, you got to understand that, you know, it didn't have a you know, a low pass filter, kind of like how we have right here. So with the 1084, it just kind of made some changes to the EQ circuit, which you know, is very incredible because it actually lets you dial in a little bit more. You know, back in the day, they didn't really have much in regards to actual like EQ. They had to use a lot of microphone positioning as well, which is very important. You know, they were using how much, you know, frequency content was going into the microphone to tell the human ear, you know, where everything was at in the mix in regards to like, you know, the drums, the vocals, and all that nice stuff. So that's amazing that we have here. This is like the clean output, and this is like the dirty output. So, you know, you can play around with these to catch a tone, right? And that's very important with Michael Jackson, catching the tone, right? And you also have the high Q, which lets you get a little bit more precise. And I want you guys to pay attention to how he didn't even have a pop filter on his C12, which is, I think is very important, right? It's funny how, you know, like I always tell you guys, you got to learn how to work the mic. And if the artist doesn't know how to work the mic, you're responsible as an engineer to tell them, how to work the mic. Just tell them to back up here or there. Maybe there's certain words that bring out certain consonants or certain, amounts of frequency that may not necessarily sound good, right? So, okay, let's understand. Look at how Michael Jackson is literally singing into a microphone without no pop filter. I think that's just so incredible. It's crazy how nowadays we have pop filters and people still might be like, oh, well, my vocals sound too harsh and they sound too sibilant and there's nothing I can do to make them sound right. Well, you got to just understand that, sometimes maybe it's about how hard you're hitting that microphone, or maybe it's about the words that are responding to the microphone, right? So that's why the frequency response is very important, because maybe sometimes certain things that you're saying are getting caught more by the microphone. So you have to understand that as well. It was an 1176 that he was using, right? So the 1176 is known to be a FET compressor that has, solid state components in it. And it's very beautiful in the way that it can do, a distortion, the characteristics, right? The darkness, right? The circuitry. So originally the 1176s right here, we still have them, the low noise. These are the revised models. I believe there is some changes to it, right? Because you got to understand, with analog gear, sometimes these parts, they're not around anymore. Even with the AKG, right? What happened was, I believe there was some changes in ownership, right? And then sometimes those components, they go out of stock, or they don't even come back, right? So you got to understand that sometimes a company like Telefunken will take over, right? And make their own reissue that might be possibly more truer to the original version. So that's why you got to do a little bit of research. And let's go back to the microphone and also look at, just the way the microphone is set up. Look at the tube right here. That tube is very important, because that's what it gives it its sound. That's what gives it its harmonic content. That's what also does the frequency response with the way it naturally rolls off the top end, right? So a bright voice like Michael Jackson, you want it to be bright, you want it to be present and cut through the mix, but you got to understand the tools that you're using, right? And that's why they selected the tube, because of the way it sounded. People want to talk about these microphones, but not possibly how it is like to have these microphones. Sometimes with these microphones and analog hardware in general, you need to literally have it turned on like a whole hour. Literally a whole hour before you even get, started into it, because it has to warm up, right? So people want to talk about CL1B, this and that, but you got to talk about the ownership of it as well. I can't just sell you a car without telling you it don't got no brakes in it, because that would be very irresponsible. The Telefunken is actually a little bit more truer to the original one, and this microphone requires a lot of gain, so it actually comes with like a separate, cloud lifter, and you get to see all those different Polaroid patterns as well, right? So that's why a preamp was always important, right? To properly power these mics to get the most out of it, right? And that's in general with any vintage microphone, right? So a Townsend would be, a reasonable solution, right? So it's known to be very, gritty, very aggressive, right? And that's actually very good for Michael Jackson. He actually used, an example I have where he used it is Thriller. Think about how much sustain Thriller has. This is Thriller, Thriller night, midnight, na. Like, think about how much sustain that he has in his notes. So that's where the 1176 shines, right? And it's like, like the release stages, right? Because the very first release on the 1176, it lets go of it quickly. But it's, subsequently, as it's, going through the rest of the notes, the release starts to get slower and slower and slower. So it makes it very musical. With the 1176, it's very, very versatile in the sense that, you can get, subtle compression with the light, 4:1 ratio. You can also get limiting ratios, which is like 20, or the all buttons, in which will kind of give you the limiting hyperactive pumping breathing effect, right? So for rap vocals, I don't necessarily feel like an 1176 would always be appropriate, depending on the flow, right? If it's like that Michael Jackson flow, right, go listen to Thriller and pay attention to how the notes all have that sustain, that long tail, right? It's okay to do that, I feel like, for a singing song, but with rapping, the way the flows are switching up, I feel like maybe possibly an 1176, if not worked correctly, it could give that some pump and artifacts. But if you have somebody talented like Michael Jackson who can work a microphone, they will already know, okay, I gotta back up, a little bit, maybe at certain words. So it may possibly always work for a rap vocal. I'm not completely sure, right? But these things we always have to be aware about. I don't know what type of compressor that is. I'm suspecting that maybe it's an optical compressor, but more than likely it's probably not, just due to the fact that an optical compressor is usually like about 2 units, right? right? 2 rack spaces, and that's what you always got to consider if you want to get any gear or any equipment. Like, you need space to put some of this stuff, and people have home studios, right? So you got to always think about how much real estate do I have, like how much land do I have inside of my home studio to put some of this equipment. You know, even if you do get the cheaper budget or friendly versions, right, just due to the ergonomics, you know, the amount of space that it takes up to put the you know, the tubes and the transformers inside of like an LA2A. Maybe that's not an LA2A, maybe it's an Abbey Road RS compressor. I'm not completely sure about that, but I don't want to assume what it is. Maybe they probably didn't even use. I wanted to just also talk about how I saw this article right here, and it said that sometimes they used to use the 1176 because there's a brightness and presence, right? But most importantly, right, sometimes people used to even turn it off. Right, so that's what I'm always talking about, saturation. Sometimes you don't got to use compression. Sometimes you can just use the parts. Even back in the day, right, they had to understand that, hey, you know, this thing has a certain part in it, so maybe I don't got to use the compressor. I can just get the tonal characteristics, right? And I'm really happy when I saw that article, because it just made me feel like I'm you know, I'm leading you guys in the right direction. Because even back in the day, they were just turning off the compressor sometimes, and that's why I always try to suggest to y'all, you know, sometimes it's not about what that thing does, but what that thing can do for you. What are the parts inside of it, right? And understanding what are those parts going to bring to the vocal and how it can play to the strengths, right? So the LA2A, let's talk about that a little bit quickly. That it actually uses light. It actually uses a luminescent light, right? It has, you know, that's why they call it a optical compressor, because it's using light. But there's actually different types of, you know, optical cells. There's the T4A, the B, and the C, right? So you got to understand that when the audio signal is coming through this, you know, LA2A, when that, you know, that signal starts to come through the LA2A, like, it starts to get brighter. The light starts to get brighter. But the main important thing is that you know, that compression isn't instant, right? Where 1176, like, that is very quick, solid state components. So the attack time is like 20 microseconds, which is so quick, right? And that's what I'm saying. Like, I'm thinking of Michael Jackson's song, where sometimes he might be like sometimes, you know, 1176 can be so aggressive with that 20 microsecond attack and just grab every single thing. So sometimes using the optical compressor is a little bit better because it's slower, right? And it also has that multi-release stage thing too, right? Where in the beginning with the optical cell, it will let go of the signal pretty quick, but then slowly it will go about its paces, and it will take longer for it to come back to the original. You can't just use something out of context. You need to understand the history, where it's been, to know where to take it, where to go with it, right? So that's an important thing to talk about, right? Now let's talk about the tape machine. The tape machine is very important as well. I feel like that's something that a lot of people are not talking about, right? But the tape machine is what gave it the tone, the characteristics, the saturation. You know, it kind of even did a little bit of EQ depending on the IPS speed, which is the frequency response, right? Well, not necessarily the frequency response, but you know how it handles those frequencies, right? Like 30 IPS, it has a better high-end response, right? So it can make the whole mix sound brighter, and sometimes that 15 IPS is a little bit more neutral out of all of them, and the 7.5 has the poorest, so it makes it sound darker. So they used to use that in a way where they didn't have to use that much EQ or anything like that, because a lot of the grit, a lot of the stuff was coming not only from the console but from the tape that they were using, right? So let's look at how much it would cost to like get like a Studer A800 right now, right? And I was looking at a couple Studers, right? And you know, they're running for about $25,000, and that's a well-maintained one, right? So let's look at the Studer. You know, you have you know, the tape, you know, I believe one is the playback head and the other one is the record head. I'm not completely sure which one it was. I mean, these things were made long before I was alive, right? But it's still good to look at them and understand like where these things were coming from, right? So let's look at this Studer tape. And you know, it's funny how people always complain about gain staging, but imagine if you had to work one of these things. I remember Eddie Kramer, what he said about all of Jimi Hendrix's songs, right, is that when he was mixing it, the needles would stay like that on the Studer A800, and that like blew my mind, because I was like, damn, that boy was really distorting the song the whole way, Eddie Kramer, when he was doing Jimi Hendrix. But that's what gave it the sound. That's what gave it that distortion is what made the guitar talk to people, made it larger than life. So distortion is a very beautiful thing. When you think about distortion in the digital realm, you think about, oh, that's bad, I'm clipping. But in the analog way, it's a little bit more different, you know. So you got to understand the history and everything. Let's look at this Studer, right? This Studer is actually pretty well maintained. I'm not gonna lie. You know, looking at this Studer, and then right here you had you know, the transport and everything like that. So That's got to be tough, you know. That's why there was multiple engineers back in the day, because you had like your tape op, the person who was working in the tape. Then you got one person who's out in the live room getting the microphones right. Then you got another engineer who's in the control room, which would probably be the head engineer, right? Who's just giving the commands on the talk back, telling everybody, oh yeah, adjust this, adjust that. So it's beautiful because when there's multiple people making a song, not only what it does is it adds more perspective to it. You know what I mean? Everybody's getting their perspective and opinion on it, right? So yeah, this Studer is pretty beautiful, and this used to be like, I guess, the remote, or the, you know, little remote control, right? And I seen Steve Albany, like, it's the craziest thing ever how with Pro Tools we have quick punch and all that stuff, and that's the beautiful thing about Pro Tools. That's what Pro Tools was made for. It was made to get rid of all the slowness and the inefficiencies of editing, right? But I seen that like people used to have to hop on this thing, and they used to have to play the tape back, so they had to like rewind it, and they had to precisely like click it in. So like it was really a skill to hop on top of these things and just like really like be actually a good engineer, versus where nowadays we got it so good and so sweet, all you got to do is click spacebar. Imagine how that easy was that. But back in the day, people have to, you know, go back, maybe sometimes even realign the tape, and if they wanted to make an edit, they had to get a razor and they had to cut the tape. Imagine how scary that was, right? Imagine how easily you could mess up a song, especially if you got Michael Jackson in there, right? And this tape machine is actually freaking beautiful. This right here is a ATR master tape. We already all know about that. You know, sometimes they would use tape for tracking, and then there was a certain tape for mastering, possibly because it had a higher kind of like a grade, right, to it. And the last thing that we have right here is, let's talk about Bruce Swedien, right? The beautiful thing about the Universal Audio is literally they modeled Bruce Swedien's console, right? And you go to the preset right here, and look, it says Jackson vocal satisfaction. So isn't that beautiful nowadays in this time that you can literally just get that plug in and get in the ballpark, even though it's not going to make you sound like Michael Jackson, even though you don't have Michael Jackson's talent, at least at the very least you're inside of the ballpark. And that's what it's all about, you know, help find plugins that can get you in the ballpark of being competitive. So we can see, you know, what Bruce Swedien, you know, had on his console, right? And he said, Bruce Swedien, that, you know, they modeled his Harrison console. And let me give you a little brief overview about how everything is so beautifully connected. I know this video is a little bit long, but Bill Putnam, right, who is the owner of Universal Audio, right, had Bruce Swedien as his apprentice. So Bruce Swedien used to be like his little bro, like he used to run everywhere with him and do all his little stuff for him, right? So it's just amazing. Like, you know, Bill Putnam gave some game to Bruce Swedien that Bruce Swedien went on to probably use on a lot of Michael Jackson records. So it's beautiful how everything is connected. And then you also have Mr. Harrison, right, who also made some amazing consoles as well. Some very beautiful sounding consoles that were responsible for Thriller and many hit songs, right? So we have to understand that why was Bill Putnam looking at a young Bruce Swedien, who at the time probably didn't even record Michael Jackson? He probably has some good work under his belt, right? But what made Bill Putnam look at Bruce Swedien and be like, you're gonna be my apprentice, right? I see something special in you. Even though I don't know how you use the equipment or what plugins you use or anything like that, what is it coming down to? What distinguishes an engineer? And it's all coming to this, the heart right here, right? When you have a genuine heart and a genuine love for the game of music, it's gonna glow, it's gonna show. Like everybody in the world and their mama and their cousin is gonna know, like, hey, this guy right here, he really loves music. When I press play, I can just hear how much love and how much fun he has making music, right? And that's kind of like the same thing that Bill Putnam, when he was looking at young Bruce Swedien, making him his apprentice, like, yeah, you know, even though I'm Bill Putnam, even though I made the 1176, the LA2A, even though I'm the man, you know, I'm still gonna help this little kid right here because there's just something about him, something special. His love for the game, I can see it inside of him. Let me give him an opportunity. So that's what it's always coming down to, y'all. I just gotta love the game of music, right? And it's just so beautiful how everything is coming back into full circle years and years and years later. You know, the love for the game is bringing it back down to something as simple as a universal audio interface, having console, being able to click Harrison 32, presets, Michael Jackson vocal satisfaction, and seeing everything there, literally a snapshot of history, because that's what music is all about. It's about taking a picture, a snapshot of a moment, and a snapshot of magic. So I just want to say thanks a lot for being a great part of my YouTube family. I hope you guys learned a lot. This was Michael Jackson's $40,000 recording signal flow chain. Just want to say thanks a lot for being a great part of my family. I hope you guys did learn something a lot. Appreciate it now. Peace.